Atlantis, the civilization that vanished in a single night. A city more advanced than anything that should have existed, vanished in a single night beneath the ocean. This series presents the legend of Atlantis through quiet storytelling, allowing knowledge to be absorbed without noticing while you rest, work, or unwind. Let the story unfold slowly. There is nothing to focus on, just knowledge finding its way in. Close your eyes if you like, or keep them open. Either way, this is a story that has survived for nearly 2,500 years, passed from priests to poets to philosophers, whispered across empires, printed in forgotten books, debated in university lecture halls, and searched for in the depths of every ocean on Earth. It is a story about a civilization so magnificent that even the gods could not tolerate its perfection forever. And it begins not in Atlantis itself, but in a quiet Egyptian temple, in the ancient city of Sais, where an old man sat across from a Greek traveller and said something that would echo through all of human history. The traveller was Solon. He was one of the wisest men Athens had ever produced, a lawmaker, a poet, a statesman who had rewritten the very foundations of Athenian democracy. And yet, when he arrived in Egypt around the year 600 before the Common Era, he was humbled almost immediately. He had come to Sais, a city at the mouth of the Nile Delta, sacred to the goddess Neith, whom the Egyptians believed was the same as the Greek goddess Athena. The priests of Sais received him warmly. They recognized in Solon a mind hungry for knowledge, a man willing to sit and listen rather than merely speak. And Solon did speak at first. He tried to impress the priests with the antiquity of Greek history, telling them of Phoreneus, reputed to be the first man, and of Deucalion and the Great Flood, and of the genealogies that traced Greek civilization back through the centuries. The old priest listened patiently, and when Solon had finished, the priest looked at him and said something devastating. He said, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are but children. There is never an old man among you." Think about the weight of that sentence for a moment. A priest of an ancient civilization looking at one of the brightest minds of Greece and telling him that everything he knew was young, that the memory of his entire culture was shallow compared to the records carved into the stone pillars of Egypt. The priest explained that catastrophes had repeatedly wiped out Greek civilization, fires from the sky and floods from the sea, and each time the Greeks had to start again from nothing, forgetting everything that came before. The Egyptians, sheltered by the Nile and its predictable rhythms, had kept their records intact across millennia. And in those records, the priest said, there was an account of something extraordinary, something that had happened 9,000 years before Solon's time. Now pause on that number. 9,000 years before Solon would place the events roughly around 9,600 before the Common Era. That is more than 11,500 years ago from where we stand today. That is a date that falls at the very end of the last ice age, a period when massive glaciers were melting, coastlines were shifting, and the climate of the entire planet was in upheaval. Whether Plato intended that number literally or symbolically, it lands in one of the most dramatic chapters of geological history. And that coincidence, if it is a coincidence, has haunted researchers ever since. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the temple in Sais, where the old priest was telling Solon about a war. He said that 9,000 years before their conversation, there had existed a great island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is what the ancients called the Strait of Gibraltar. This island was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and from it one could travel to other islands, and from those islands to a vast continent that surrounded the true ocean. Within the Pillars, the empire of this island reached all the way to Egypt in the south, and to Tyrrhenia, modern-day Italy, in the north. This was no small kingdom. This was a superpower, a naval empire that had conquered vast stretches of the known world. And then it attacked Athens, or rather, it attacked the ancestors of Athens, a civilization so old that even the Athenians of Solon's day had forgotten it existed. According to the priest, this ancient Athens was a model society, virtuous and well governed. And when the Atlantean Empire swept eastward in conquest, Athens alone stood against it. Deserted by its allies, fighting at the very edge of destruction, ancient Athens defeated the invaders and freed all the peoples who lived within the Mediterranean. It was a moment of extraordinary heroism, a victory of virtue over power, of discipline over excess. But then came the catastrophe. Violent earthquakes and floods struck without warning, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the entire warrior class of Athens sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. After that, the ocean in that region became impassable, choked with mud and shallow debris left by the sunken island. The priest's account ended there, a story of glory and destruction, of divine punishment and geological violence. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of an entire civilization vanishing in 24 hours. Not declining over centuries like Rome, not fading into obscurity like the Hittites, but simply gone. One sunset it existed, the next sunrise it did not. The harbour that had launched 1,000 ships was now silt. The temples where priests had chanted to Poseidon were now cold water and darkness. The markets where traders had haggled over copper and ivory were now buried under tons of ocean mud. And nobody remembered. Nobody except the priests of Egypt, who carved everything into stone because they knew, better than anyone, that memory written on paper or spoken aloud is fragile. That civilizations forget themselves unless someone makes an effort to preserve the record. Solon returned to Athens. He reportedly began composing a great poem about what he had learned, an epic that would have rivaled Homer. But he never finished it. He died before the work was completed, and his notes passed down through his family. Several generations later, those notes reached a man whose mind was perhaps the most extraordinary in the ancient world. That man was Plato. Plato was born around 428 before the Common Era in Athens. He was a student of Socrates, the founder of the Academy, and arguably the most influential philosopher in Western history. Around the year 360 before the Common Era, near the end of his life, Plato wrote 2 dialogues that would immortalize the story of Atlantis. The first was called Timaeus. The second was called Critias. Together, they contain the only ancient account of Atlantis that has survived. In these dialogues, a character also named Critias, who was Plato's own ancestor, relates the story that Solon had brought back from Egypt. And here is where we must pause again and consider something important. Plato was not writing a travel guide or a history book. He was writing philosophy. His dialogues were designed to explore ideas about justice, governance, the ideal state, the dangers of corruption and excess. Many scholars today believe that Atlantis was never meant to be a real place at all. They argue that Plato invented the entire story as an allegory, a moral tale about what happens when a powerful civilization abandons virtue and succumbs to greed. In this reading, Atlantis is a mirror held up to Athens itself, a warning about the corrupting influence of imperial ambition. And yet, Plato never said the story was fiction. He went out of his way to anchor it in specific details, naming real people like Solon, real places like Sais and the Pillars of Heracles, and providing elaborate descriptions of geography, architecture, and military organization. No other Platonic myth comes close to this level of detail. The allegory argument is strong, but the specificity of the account has kept the question alive for over 2,000 years. So, let us look at those details, because they are extraordinary. According to Plato, the island of Atlantis was given to the god Poseidon when the gods divided the world among themselves. Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, the daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, who lived on a hill near the center of the island. To protect her and their home, Poseidon carved the hill into a fortress, surrounding it with alternating rings of sea and land, 3 rings of water and 2 of earth, each one perfectly circular, centered on the hill where Cleito lived. He brought 2 springs up through the earth, one of warm water and one of cold, and made every kind of food grow abundantly from the soil. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 princes in all. The eldest was named Atlas, and from him the island and the surrounding ocean took their names. Atlas became the first king, and his descendants ruled after him for many generations. Each of the other 9 princes was given a portion of the island to govern, creating a federation of 10 kingdoms united under Atlas's line. The Atlanteans built bridges across the water rings and tunnels beneath them, so that ships could pass through the stone and enter the harbour at the island's centre. They dug a great canal from the outermost ring to the sea, wide enough and deep enough for the largest vessels of the age. Every passage to the city was guarded by gates and towers, and walls surrounded each ring of the city. The walls were constructed of red, white, and black stone, quarried from the rings themselves, and were covered with metals, the outermost wall with brass, the next with tin, and the innermost wall, which enclosed the citadel, with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that glowed with a reddish fire. That word, orichalcum, has fascinated people for centuries. Plato described it as the most precious metal known to the Atlanteans after gold. The name comes from the Greek words for mountain and copper. For a long time, scholars debated whether orichalcum was a real substance or a Platonic invention. Then, in 2015, marine archaeologists recovered 39 ingots of an unknown alloy from a 2,600-year-old shipwreck off the coast of Gela in Sicily. Analysis revealed that the metal was composed of roughly 75 to 80% copper, 15 to 20% zinc, with traces of nickel, lead, and iron. In 2016, another 47 ingots of the same composition were found at the same site. The alloy was essentially a high-quality ancient brass, and many researchers now believe this is what the ancients meant when they spoke of orichalcum. It does not prove that Atlantis existed, of course, but it confirms that the metal Plato described was real, that it was traded across the Mediterranean, and that it was valued highly enough to be shipped in large quantities. At the center of the city stood a temple dedicated to Poseidon, enormous in scale, a stadium in length and half a stadium in width, covered on the outside with silver except for the pinnacles, which were plated in gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, decorated everywhere with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The floors, the walls, and the pillars were all lined with orichalcum. Golden statues filled the temple, including one of Poseidon himself, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head touched the ceiling. Around the temple were statues of the original 10 kings and their wives, and many other offerings accumulated over centuries. There is a loneliness in descriptions this detailed. Plato is painting a picture of something magnificent, and then telling you it no longer exists. Every golden pinnacle, every orichalcum-clad pillar, every carved statue is already underwater by the time you read about it. The beauty is inseparable from the loss, and that tension between splendor and destruction is what gives the Atlantis story its emotional power. The island itself was enormously fertile. Plato described a great rectangular plain stretching 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 555 kilometers by 370 kilometers, surrounded by mountains that sheltered it from the north wind. The plain was irrigated by an elaborate system of canals, and the soil produced 2 harvests a year. The forests provided timber for shipbuilding. Hot and cold springs fed baths and gardens. The island had elephants and every kind of animal, both domestic and wild. It had fruits and grains and fragrant plants. It was, in short, a paradise, a land of almost impossible abundance. And here is where the story turns dark, because paradise does not last, not in mythology, not in philosophy, and perhaps not in reality either. For many generations, Plato tells us, the Atlanteans were obedient to the laws and devoted to Poseidon. They possessed what he called true and great spirits, practicing gentleness and wisdom. They valued virtue over material wealth. They understood that their riches were increased by mutual friendship combined with virtue, and that excessive zeal for material things would lead to the loss of both their possessions and their character. But gradually, as the divine element in their nature became diluted through repeated mixing with mortal blood, human nature began to dominate. They became unable to bear the burden of their good fortune. They grew visibly debased, losing the fairest of their most precious gifts. To those who could see, they appeared wretched, having squandered the finest qualities they possessed. But to those who were blind to true happiness, they seemed gloriously blessed, filled as they were with unjust ambition and power. This is one of the most psychologically acute passages in all of ancient literature. Plato is describing a specific kind of corruption, the kind where the corrupt cannot see their own corruption, where decline looks like success from the inside. The Atlanteans were not overthrown by enemies or weakened by plague. They rotted from within. Their character failed before their civilization did. And then Zeus, the king of the gods, perceiving that an honorable race was in a woeful plight, and wanting to inflict punishment upon them, so that they might learn wisdom and become better, gathered all the gods into their most holy habitation and spoke. The dialogue breaks off here. The Critias is unfinished. We never hear what Zeus said. We never get the full account of Atlantis' destruction. the most famous lost civilization in history, is described in an unfinished manuscript, a story that breaks off mid-sentence, leaving us forever wondering what Plato intended to say next. Some scholars believe Plato simply grew old and stopped writing. Others suggest he abandoned the project because the dramatic demands of the story exceeded what his philosophical framework could support. Still, others wonder if the unfinished ending was itself intentional, a way of forcing the reader to supply the conclusion, to imagine the catastrophe and draw the moral lesson without being told what it was. Whatever the reason, the silence at the end of Critias is haunting. It is like visiting a cathedral and finding the final wall missing, open sky where stone should be. The story trails off into nothing, and that nothing has been filled over the centuries with more speculation, more theories, and more obsession than almost any other story in human history. Let us move forward through time now and trace how the legend of Atlantis evolved after Plato. For centuries after Plato's death, opinion was divided. His own student Aristotle reportedly dismissed Atlantis, declaring that the man who invented it also destroyed it. The Neoplatonists, writing several centuries later, took the story more seriously, seeing in it profound cosmological truths. The Roman philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century of the Common Era, claimed that a Greek named Crantor had actually visited Sais and seen the pillars on which the story of Atlantis was inscribed. But Crantor's account, like so many things from the ancient world, has not survived. Through the Middle Ages, Atlantis largely faded from European consciousness. The Arab geographers, who inherited much of Greek learning, kept the story alive in fragments, and medieval European writers occasionally referenced it. But it was not until the Renaissance that Atlantis roared back to life. In 1626, the English philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon published a utopian novel called New Atlantis. It described an ideal society on a fictional island called Bensalem, where a research institution called Salomon's House pursued knowledge through systematic experimentation. Bacon used the Atlantis myth as a framework for imagining what human civilization could become if it dedicated itself to science rather than conquest. His vision of Salomon's House is often credited as one of the inspirations for the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, and for the modern research university. In Bacon's hands, Atlantis stopped being a cautionary tale about corruption and became a blueprint for progress. The lost civilization was reimagined as a civilization that had been found, or at least one that could be built. But the truly transformative moment in the history of Atlantis came in 1882, when a Minnesota politician named Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, The Antediluvian World. Donnelly was a remarkable figure, a lawyer, a congressman, and an insatiable reader who consumed vast amounts of archaeological, geological, and mythological literature. His book argued that Plato's account was essentially factual, that Atlantis had been a real island in the Atlantic Ocean, and that it was the cradle of all human civilization. Every ancient culture, Donnelly claimed, from the Egyptians to the Maya to the Irish, had descended from the Atlanteans. The book was a sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Prime Minister William Gladstone of Britain reportedly considered commissioning a Royal Navy expedition to search for Atlantis after reading it. Donnelly's writing was lucid, energetic, and overwhelmingly persuasive on first reading, even though many of his facts were wrong or have since been disproven. He drew parallels between the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Central America, between the flood myths of different cultures, between the languages and customs of peoples separated by oceans. These parallels, he argued, could only be explained by a common origin in Atlantis. The influence of Donnelly's book cannot be overstated. It established the template for virtually every Atlantis theory that followed. The idea that Atlantis possessed technology beyond its time, that it was the origin of all races and civilizations, that its destruction was a historical catastrophe echoed in flood myths worldwide. All of these notions can be traced back to Donnelly. His work inspired Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement, the science fiction writers of the early 20th century, the New Age movement, and the endless stream of documentaries, books, and YouTube videos that continue to this day. And speaking of flood myths, this is perhaps the most intriguing thread in the entire Atlantis discussion. Nearly every ancient civilization on Earth has a story about a great flood that destroyed the world. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 before the Common Era, tells of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the gods to build a boat and save his family and the animals from a catastrophic deluge. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah receives the same warning and builds an ark. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus to punish humanity. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish to build a vessel to weather a cosmic flood. The Ojibwe people of North America tell of a great flood that covered the land. The Hopi people recount a deluge that cleansed the earth. Similar stories exist in Chinese, Australian Aboriginal, and South American traditions. Why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, tell essentially the same story? The conventional explanation is that floods are universal natural phenomena, and every civilization that lives near water eventually experiences a devastating one. Local floods, amplified by oral tradition and religious interpretation, become cosmic floods over generations of retelling. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly in ancient Mesopotamia. The Mediterranean experienced catastrophic tsunamis. The Black Sea may have experienced a sudden and dramatic rise in water level around 5,600 before the Common Era, potentially inspiring flood myths across the region. But there is another possibility, one that connects directly to Plato's timeline. The end of the last ice age, the period around 11,600 years ago, was marked by genuinely catastrophic environmental changes. During the glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. An area of land the size of Europe and China combined was exposed. As the ice sheets melted, that land was gradually swallowed by rising seas. But the melting was not always gradual. There were episodes of rapid sea level rise, known as meltwater pulses, during which enormous volumes of water poured into the oceans in geologically brief periods. The Younger Dryas, a climatic period lasting from roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, was particularly dramatic. At its onset, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped sharply, plunging parts of Europe and North America back into near glacial conditions. Then, around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended with startling abruptness. Greenland ice cores show that temperatures in Greenland rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. the remaining ice sheets destabilized. Sea levels surged. Coastlines that had been inhabited for generations vanished beneath the waves. Is it possible that the folk memory of these cataclysmic events survived in oral tradition for thousands of years, eventually crystallizing into the flood myths we find across cultures? Some researchers think so. The timing is suggestive. Plato's date of 9600, before the Common Era, falls right at the boundary of the Younger Dryas and the Holocene, exactly when the most dramatic climate changes were occurring. This does not prove that Atlantis was real, but it does raise the possibility that Plato's story preserved, in highly mythologized form, a cultural memory of genuine prehistoric catastrophe. The pattern of sudden destruction, followed by gradual forgetting, is one of the oldest themes in human storytelling. And it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many times has this happened? How many settlements, how many communities, how many entire cultures were erased when the waters rose and the coastlines moved inland? We have no way of knowing. The archaeological record from the late Pleistocene is fragmentary at best. The places where coastal peoples would have lived 12,000 years ago are now under dozens of meters of ocean water. We are looking for evidence in precisely the places where evidence is hardest to find. Consider the scale of what was lost. At the height of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the world's oceans were so depleted that an additional 10 million square kilometers of land were exposed compared to today. That is an area roughly equivalent to Europe. People lived on those lands. They hunted there, gathered food, built shelters, told stories, buried their dead. And when the seas rose, all of that disappeared. The stone tools and cooking fires and dwelling sites of entire generations were swallowed by salt water and buried under marine sediment. We cannot excavate what we cannot reach. And so, there are gaps in our knowledge, enormous gaps, that we have only recently begun to acknowledge. This is important context for understanding why the Atlantis story refuses to die. It is not simply that people enjoy a good mystery, though they do. It is that the geological and archaeological record genuinely supports the idea that catastrophic flooding destroyed coastal settlements at the end of the Ice Age. The question is not whether civilizations were lost to rising seas. The question is how sophisticated those civilizations were, and whether any of them approached anything like what Plato described. That remains an open question, one that underwater archaeology may eventually help to answer. The military structure of Atlantis, as Plato described it, was staggering in its scale. The island's 10 kingdoms could muster an army of over 1 million soldiers, including 10,000 chariots, 1,200 warships, and vast contingents of archers, slingers, and javelin throwers. The harbour of the central city was filled with vessels and merchants arriving from every direction, creating a constant noise of voices and activity throughout the day and night. This was not a quiet backwater. This was the beating heart of a maritime empire, a city built for power and projection, for trade and war in equal measure. The laws that governed the 10 kingdoms were inscribed by the first kings on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon. Every 5 and every 6 years, alternately, the 10 kings would gather in the temple to deliberate on matters of common interest and to pass judgment on any king who had violated the sacred laws. Before passing judgment, they would capture one of the sacred bulls that roamed freely within the temple precincts, using only clubs and nooses, no weapons of metal, and sacrifice the animal over the inscribed pillar, letting its blood flow across the words of Poseidon's law. Then they would drink from golden cups and swear an oath to judge according to the inscriptions. It was a ritual of breathtaking solemnity, binding the rulers to their divine heritage and to each other. And the fact that it eventually failed, that the kings eventually became corrupt despite all these safeguards, makes the ritual even more poignant. Think about what Plato is really saying here. He is saying that no system of law, however sacred, is immune to human weakness. No ritual, however ancient, can permanently protect a society from its own worst impulses. The orichalcum pillar, the sacred bull, the golden cup, the inscribed oath, none of it mattered in the end. The divine element faded, the mortal element grew, and the structure collapsed from within. This is not just a story about a city. This is a philosophy of civilization, compressed into myth. The search for a real Atlantis has taken researchers to some extraordinary places. One of the most compelling candidates is the island of Santorini, ancient Thera, in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 before the Common Era, a volcanic eruption of staggering magnitude devastated Thera, one of the most powerful eruptions in human history, with a volcanic explosivity index of 6 or 7. The eruption buried the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri under meters of volcanic ash, preserving it in remarkable detail, much like Pompeii would be preserved by Vesuvius some 16 centuries later. When archaeologists excavated Akrotiri, beginning in 1967, they found a sophisticated urban centre with multi-story buildings, advanced drainage systems, paved streets, and stunning frescoes depicting dolphins, lilies, ships, and everyday life. The Minoans of Thera were part of a larger civilization centered on Crete, a maritime culture with extensive trade networks, sophisticated art, and impressive engineering. Intriguingly, no human remains have been found at Akrotiri, suggesting the inhabitants had advance warning and evacuated before the final eruption. The eruption of Thera sent tsunamis crashing into the northern coast of Crete. Ashfall disrupted agriculture across the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, already weakened, entered a long decline that would eventually lead to its absorption by the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The parallels with Plato's account are suggestive. A powerful island civilization, a sudden natural disaster, tsunamis, the collapse of a way of life. Even the geography has echoes. Santorini's caldera, the collapsed remains of the volcanic crater, forms a rough ring of islands surrounding a central lagoon, dimly reminiscent of Plato's concentric rings. But the Minoan hypothesis has serious problems. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Aegean. His Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined, not a small volcanic island. His timeline places the events 9,000 years before Solon, not a mere 900. Some researchers have suggested that these discrepancies result from Egyptian to Greek translation errors, that the priests may have used a different unit of time, or that Plato deliberately inflated the numbers for dramatic effect. But these explanations require a lot of special pleading, and most classicists remain skeptical. In recent years, the Richat Structure in Mauritania, a 40-kilometer-wide geological formation in the Sahara Desert, sometimes called the Eye of Africa, has gained popularity as a candidate for Atlantis, particularly through YouTube channels and social media. The structure consists of concentric rings of rock exposed by erosion, and from satellite images, the resemblance to Plato's description of a circular city is visually striking. Proponents argue that the structure was once at a lower elevation, that the Sahara was once wet and habitable, and that the dimensions roughly match Plato's account. However, the geological evidence overwhelmingly contradicts this theory. The Richat structure is approximately 100 million years old, formed by the erosion of an elevated geological dome, not by human engineering. No archaeological evidence of a city, no pottery, no foundations, no metal objects, no worked stone has been found at the site. The Sahara has been a desert for millions of years, and while the region did experience wetter periods during the early Holocene, there is no evidence it was covered by ocean water in the last 12,000 years. Most geologists and archaeologists consider the Richat-Atlantis connection to be a case of pattern recognition, the human tendency to see meaningful shapes in random formations, rather than genuine evidence of a lost civilization. Southern Spain has also attracted attention, particularly the marshlands of Donana National Park in Andalusia. In 2011, a National Geographic documentary featured research by a team led by archaeologist Richard Freund, who suggested that Atlantis had been located on the Spanish coast near the Strait of Gibraltar and was destroyed by a tsunami. The team found circular formations in the marshland that they interpreted as possible remnants of an ancient city. In 2018, a British exploration firm called Merlin Burrows announced that satellite imagery had revealed circular structures in the same area. However, subsequent investigation revealed that the circular formations were actually experimental zooplankton ponds created by modern scientists in 2004 and 2005. No peer-reviewed archaeological excavation has confirmed the presence of an ancient civilization in the marshlands. The search continues. Atlantis has been placed in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in Indonesia, in the Andes, in the North Sea, on Malta, off the coast of Japan, and in dozens of other locations. Each theory has its adherents, its evidence, and its passionate defenders. But the fundamental problem remains the same. There is no confirmed archaeological evidence that the civilization Plato described ever existed. And perhaps that is the wrong question to ask. Perhaps the real significance of Atlantis lies not in whether it was real, but in what the story tells us about ourselves. Consider what happened in southeastern Turkey in the mid-1990s. A Kurdish shepherd near the city of Sanliurfa noticed strange stones protruding from a hillside. Those stones turned out to be the top of Gobekli Tepe, a monumental complex of carved stone pillars dating to approximately 9,500 before the Common Era, more than 11,000 years ago. The pillars, some standing 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 60 tons, were carved with intricate reliefs of animals, including lions, foxes, gazelles, and birds. They were arranged in circular enclosures up to 20 meters across, built by people who had not yet invented pottery or metal tools, who had not yet domesticated animals or cultivated crops. Gobekli Tepe shattered the conventional timeline of human civilization. Before its discovery, archaeologists believed that monumental architecture could only be produced by settled agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherers, the prevailing theory held, simply did not have the organization, the resources, or the motivation to build on such a scale. Gobekli Tepe proved that assumption wrong. It showed that human beings were capable of extraordinary collective effort and sophisticated symbolic thought far earlier than anyone had imagined. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations from 1995 until his death in 2014, called the site the first human-built holy place. Using ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys, his team mapped at least 16 additional megalithic rings still buried beneath the surface across 22 acres. Less than 5% of the site has been fully excavated. What lies beneath the rest of that hilltop could rewrite the story of early humanity once again. More recently, discoveries at the nearby site of Karahan Tepe, sometimes called the sister site of Gobekli Tepe, have revealed similar T-shaped pillars and elaborate stone carvings from the same period. These were not isolated achievements. They were part of a wider cultural phenomenon in Upper Mesopotamia at the end of the Ice Age, a region where wild wheat and barley grew naturally, where wild sheep and cattle roamed, and where the raw materials for agriculture were waiting to be discovered. Within 1,000 years of Gobekli Tepe's construction, the people of this region had domesticated plants and animals, launching the Neolithic revolution that would eventually give rise to cities, writing, and everything we call civilization. The site dates to almost exactly the period that Plato's priest placed the fall of Atlantis. This is almost certainly a coincidence. But it is a thought-provoking one. 11,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, human beings were building monuments that we can barely explain. What else might they have been capable of? What other achievements might have been swept away by rising seas, buried under sediment, or simply forgotten in the long millennia before writing was invented? We know with absolute certainty that the coastlines of 11,600 years ago looked nothing like the coastlines of today. Vast areas of habitable land that once supported human populations are now underwater. The Persian Gulf was dry land. The English Channel did not exist. Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia were connected by a broad landmass called Sunderland. The North Sea floor between Britain and Denmark was a fertile lowland called Doggerland, inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers whose camps and tools are occasionally brought up in fishing nets. Fishermen off the coast of Norfolk have dredged up antler harpoons and worked flints from the seabed, artifacts from a world that existed before the waves claimed it. Underwater surveys have revealed ancient river channels, lake beds, and even what appear to be settlement sites beneath the cold grey waters of the North Sea. Doggerland was not a myth. It was a real place where real people lived, and it was destroyed by rising sea levels in a process that took centuries but must have felt, to those who lived through it, like the end of the world. We have barely begun to explore these submerged landscapes. It is entirely possible, even likely, that significant human settlements lie beneath the waves, waiting to be discovered. None of this means that Atlantis was real, but it does mean that the idea of a lost civilization, a human achievement erased by natural catastrophe, is not as fantastical as it might seem. The Earth has swallowed cities before. It will swallow them again. And perhaps this is why the story has been so extraordinarily productive in the cultural imagination. Atlantis has appeared in thousands of novels, films, television programs, video games, and songs. Jules Verne sent Captain Nemo through the ruins of Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Pierre Benoit imagined a lost Atlantean queen in his 1919 novel L'Atlantide. Disney produced an animated film, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, in 2001. The BBC, National Geographic, and the History Channel have produced dozens of documentaries. The musician Donovan released a hit song called Atlantis in 1969 that spent weeks on the pop charts. The comic book character Aquaman rules an underwater kingdom modelled on the legend. Even the Space Shuttle program named one of its orbiters Atlantis. But beneath the entertainment, there is always the same gravitational pull, the same question that draws people back to Plato's unfinished dialogue. Was it real? Could it have been real? And if not, why does it feel like it should be? Perhaps the answer lies not in archaeology or geology, but in psychology. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We look at the ocean and imagine what lies beneath. We look at ancient ruins and wonder what came before them. We look at our own civilization, with all its power and fragility, and we cannot help but wonder whether it too could vanish, whether future generations might tell stories about us the way we tell stories about Atlantis. There is comfort in the idea that someone, somewhere, has already faced the worst and survived it, or at least left a record that survived. The flood myths do that. The story of Atlantis does that. They tell us that destruction is not the end, that memory persists, that even if the waters rise and the temples fall, something remains. A story, a warning, a question asked in the dark that still has no answer. What remains is the story. And the story of Atlantis endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human condition. It is a story about the tension between ambition and virtue, between what we can build and what we deserve to keep. It is a story about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly the things we take for granted can be taken away. It is a story about memory itself, about the struggle to preserve knowledge across the vast gulfs of time, and about how much we have already forgotten. The Atlanteans, according to Plato, had everything: wealth beyond measure, technology beyond their era, a land of stunning natural beauty, a society governed by law and tradition, and they lost it all, not because of an earthquake or a flood, though those were the instruments of destruction, but because they stopped being worthy of what they had. They traded wisdom for power, modesty for ambition, and in doing so, they sealed their own fate. The gods did not destroy Atlantis because they were cruel. They destroyed it because the Atlanteans had already destroyed themselves. There is a melancholy in that lesson that resonates across the ages. Every generation sees itself reflected in the mirror of Atlantis. Every empire wonders, in its quieter moments, whether it too is building on borrowed time. The story endures not because we believe a literal island sank beneath the Atlantic, but because we recognize the pattern. We have seen it in Rome. We have seen it in the great empires of the Middle East. We see echoes of it in our own time, in the tension between technological achievement and moral direction, between the power to reshape the world and the wisdom to know when to stop. Plato understood this. He was writing about Athens as much as he was writing about Atlantis. He was holding up a mirror to his own civilization, showing it the face of a society that had all the gifts of the gods and squandered them through moral failure. The fact that Athens would indeed fall, conquered by Macedon just decades after Plato's death, gives the story an additional layer of tragic irony. The warning was ignored. It usually is. Let that settle quietly. Let it rest in the space between thoughts, in the margins of your awareness. The temples of Atlantis, if they ever existed, are somewhere beneath cold water and old silt, their orichalcum walls long corroded, their golden pinnacles green with centuries of ocean growth. The statues of the 10 kings stand in darkness, if they stand at all. The great canal that connected the inner harbour to the sea is choked with sand and silence. And on the surface, the waves continue their endless rhythm, indifferent to everything that lies below. But the story survives. It always does. Stories are more durable than stone, more persistent than metal, more resilient than any empire. 2,500 years after an old philosopher in Athens set down his unfinished account of a lost civilization, we are still talking about it, still searching for it, still arguing about what it means. That is the real miracle of Atlantis. Not the city itself, which may or may not have existed, but the story, which undeniably does. It has outlasted every civilization that has tried to find it. It will outlast ours as well. If you have been listening quietly, if this story has settled into your awareness without effort, then something ancient has found its way to you tonight. Not answers, necessarily, but questions. Good questions. The kind that stay with you, that surface at unexpected moments, that make you look at the ocean a little differently the next time you stand on a shore. The kind that make you wonder, when you see a ruin, what stood there before the ruin, and what stood there before that, all the way back to the beginning of human memory, and then further still, into the darkness before memory began. We live in an age of unprecedented knowledge, and yet the past still holds secrets that humble us. Every year, new discoveries push the timeline of human achievement further back. Every year, another assumption about what our ancestors could or could not do is overturned by the evidence buried in the ground or submerged beneath the sea. The story of Atlantis, whether it is history or allegory, or some strange combination of both, reminds us that we are not the first people to build something extraordinary, and we may not be the last to lose it. If this brought you something, a moment of wonder, a new perspective, a quiet thought to carry with you, consider leaving a like or subscribing to Forming Knowledge Quietly. There are more stories like this one, stories that unfold slowly and let knowledge find its way in without pressure. Share this with someone who enjoys falling asleep to ideas, or who likes to think while they walk, or who simply appreciates the feeling of learning something without trying too hard. We will be here, telling stories in the dark, whenever you are ready to listen again.